If you crack a lobster shell, Mi'kmaq fishers are falsely blamed for threatening fisheries conservation. But who wastes the most lobster? Who was convicted of gross violations of fisheries regulations? Step up, Clearwater Seafoods. And this is Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. This is episode 156, and a thank you to listeners like Hilding Nielsen, who support us via patreon.com/Mi'kmaq Matters, or via email transfer to Mi'kmaq.matters@gmail.com. Below link.
Doesn't have to go into the water. It's just nuts. No matter if it's raining, it's going fishing.
Conservation. That's the word thrown up against Mi'kmaq fishers, asserting their treaty right to fish lobster in southwest Nova Scotia, outside the commercial fishery. But leave aside for the moment that Mi'kmaq are fishing fewer than about 500 traps, and there are commercial licenses to fish about 35,000 traps. But more than that, let's look at the corporate monster, lobster fishing area LFA 41. It's Clearwater, North America's largest distributor of shellfish. If you crack a lobster shell in Boston or New York, there's probably a Clearwater connection. But though commercial fishers are quick to hassle Mi'kmaq fishers, they won't go public with their complaints against a corporation as powerful as Clearwater. That griping goes no farther than the government war. They just watch as Clearwater does what it wants. In particular, the 72-hour rule, which requires that gear be checked at least once in that period. The same DFO that seizes the traps of Mi'kmaq fishers asserting their legal treaty right to fish has been looking the other way for years as Clearwater ignores the 72-hour rule. But then, 2 years ago, Clearwater was convicted of gross violations of lobster regulations for not obeying the 72-hour rule, which led to the wastage of lobster which died in the untended traps. Long before CBC broke the Clearwater story, Shannon Arnold has been on Clearwater's case. She's Marine Program Senior Coordinator for the Ecology Action Center in Halifax. Shannon Arnold is our guest this week. Let's start with you telling us about the 72-hour rule, what it is, and why we have it.
Well, the 72-hour rule is fairly self-explanatory. It exists in the Atlantic Fisheries Regulations, which is the laws that bind fishing practices out here. And it just means that every 72 hours you need to be out there tending your gear. So you have to check your traps or your gill net or whatever it is that you're fishing. You have to go out there and check it. There's a bit of cloudiness as to how and why this rule exists and where it came from. People talk about it having come from on one side conflict. So conflict between gear types. You know, there's a lot of gear out in the water, a lot of fishermen out in the water. So making sure that your gear is out there, making sure you're checking it, someone hasn't pulled your gear, etc. And there isn't, you know, what they call ghost gear. So that if your gear has been swept away by the tide or somebody has, you know, cut it or something, that you can go and report that it's missing. So part of it was because of conflict and just making sure people are out there checking to see what's going on. And in some of the fisheries, it was more of a conservation issue, right? So that you are out there checking, is anything entangled in my gear? You know, sea turtles, larger marine mammals, or do I have a lot of bycatch? What's going on? You know, so it's really just trying to, there's a lot of people fishing out there all the time, right? So it's really just trying to get a handle on what's happening out there. Is the gear set in the right place? Is it caught on something? All of that kind of stuff. And every fishing fleet has to do it, like Atlantic Canada.
So that brings us to Clearwater Fisheries, a name that many people will be familiar with. The largest seafood company in North America, based in your part of the world. Their corporate office is in Bedford, I think. And people might not know that it has a monopoly on a huge lobster fishing area. The entire area off the south coast of Nova Scotia, all the way from southwest Georges Bank, all the way up to basically Cape Breton and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Huge area, lobster fishing area 41. And it has a quota of 720 tons, which I guess it's hard for us to visualize that. A lot of traps. It takes a lot of traps to catch 720 tons of lobster, I guess. And the other thing, and there are two notable things about Clearwater. It has a monopoly over that area, and it has no season, which is interesting in the current context where these Mi'kmaq fishers are fishing out of season, quote unquote. So despite all the Clearwater access to that huge area, they have not been obeying the 72-hour rule, it turns out. So tell us, we had some CBC story, a kind of expose, but you were on the story of Clearwater and the 72-hour rule before CBC was on the story. So tell us how you became interested in the story. What twigged you that there might be an issue with Clearwater and the 72-hour rule?
Yeah, well, it's funny you say in spite of them having the full access. It's almost because of them having this exclusive access. And when we were looking at how that fishery operates, there's no one else out there looking at their lobster traps, and they don't really have anyone looking over their shoulder. If you're an inshore fisherman, and there are thousands of inshore fishermen in the same areas, you have this neighborhood policing in a sense, right? So you know where everybody else's traps are. You can see what's going on in the water. You got to be out there every 72 hours at least. You're usually out there every 24 hours hauling your gear. And so you have this situation where Clearwater has kind of just
when do lobsters
had this whole area to themselves and basically decided for economic reasons that they were going to consolidate all of the licenses. At one point in time, they had 2 boats, and then they thought, no, let's put them all on one big boat and keep all the same amount of traps that we have in this huge area. And we can go out and do whatever we want out there. We can go fish it when we want. We can leave it when we want. We'll just kind of use this area as our own little lobster ground, which it is in the way that they have access. And so, we have, myself and the work that we do at our organization, we work to try and support inshore fisheries. We've kept an eye on the big offshore boats on and off over years to try and figure out, what's happening. Are they having enforcement? Are people seeing what's going on out there? And this one in particular, because they own all of the licenses and they consolidate them on one boat, they also end up falling under Canadian Privacy Act rules in terms of finding out any information about them. So when we wanted to get more information about the fishery, we started to run into these roadblocks. You can't find out where they're fishing, how many traps they have at any time, and that's all because of this rule of 5, it's called, that DFO has underneath Privacy Act. Anything that's like less than 5 boats, less than 5 processing plants, less than 5 whatever, has to be amalgamated in terms of data, so you can't identify them for proprietary reasons. And so this is really problematic when you start looking at the corporate consolidated fisheries. If you have just one entity, there's kind of very little you can learn about it outside of what's on the management plan and stuff.
But just looking at it, if they have this huge area and one boat, there might be an issue because you're wondering, well, how can they fish all that area with one boat?
That's right, logistically. And when you looked at, the management plan at the time, and we were just getting to be part of the advisory committee, they're somewhere between, it says, and it had said in the management plan, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 traps out there. And so you just do the math very quickly. It's at least 50 miles offshore. You have one boat. You're supposed to be hauling all of those traps every 72 hours, or maybe not all the traps are there, but people are sitting next to Shelburne Wharf and are looking, and they don't have 10,000 traps piled up at the pier. So you start to, and of course, for many years, people knew that the general practice that they were doing was just leaving thousands of traps out there, with the escape hatch open, some of them, just because they didn't want to bring them all into the pier all the time.
So it's for them, it's an economic issue. It's cheaper for them. They can operate one boat, one crew, and just leave the traps there. So rather than hauling them up and bringing them in all that time, paying people,
They were
it's
buying
cheaper
off
to,
black
Yeah, and of
market.
course,
to not
the
obey the
price-
72-hour
I
rule.
believe you.
Yeah, so everybody knew like once or twice a year the boat would be in dock at least for 3 or 4 months getting fixed. They never saw, big piles of traps coming in. And so this was kind of known. It's been known in Southwest Nova for a long time. And so when we got really interested in it is when they were pursuing a sustainable seafood certification for this fishery. And, we thought, oh man, sustainable seafood certifications are supposed to differentiate, the really good players out there, the ones who are really putting their effort into being more sustainable. And at this time, the inshore lobster did not have a sustainability certificate. And, it is a pretty low impact fishery. You've got trap gear and it's the lifeblood of Nova Scotia. And, you're thinking, how can this offshore fishery that everybody knows has quite, is not fishing really within the rules, get this certification? And they did. They achieved that sustainability certification and they did a lot of PR about it. And Clearwater went and sat on the Stakeholder Advisory Council for that sustainability certification system and everything. And it just kind of wrangled us in the sense of, again, using that money and power and access that they have to get this special certification that allows them to access international markets who are more and more requiring some sort of sustainability certificate. And so we started to really dig into, is this possible? How can they possibly be following the 72-hour rule? And what about all of this stuff that we hear all the time about them, quote unquote, storing their traps on the ocean floor? What is that, right? And so we really started to look into it. And the first big thing that we came across really was that when I dug into the management plan, which are, the public pieces that we have from the department, the management plan had a line in it that really stuck out to me, which said that this fishery is exempt from the 72-hour rule.
What?
And I've worked in fisheries policy for quite a while. Then we sit at all the councils and committees. In order to change the 72-hour rule, which is in the Atlantic Fisheries Regulations, it would have had to go through, Gazette 1 and Gazette 2.
Yeah, it has to be changed by the Parliament of Canada. It has to be, the government has to do something to change the law.
Yeah, and we would have noticed because a lot of other people would like to change this rule. There are lots of fishermen who don't like the 72-hour rule, and if they had their way, they would also not fish by it, or they try and come up with something different. So we definitely would have noticed. So I brought that to the department, and I said, "Is this true?" Because Clearwater is also quoting this in their sustainability certificate. And we brought all of the evidence to the auditors, and we said they're not fishing in the 72-hour rule. And the certification body came back to us and said, they told us they have an exemption to the law. And so it was this kind of circle of Clearwater telling things. And so I went to DFO and I pressed them. And it took them a number of months to ferret out. And all they came back with eventually was like, oh no, thanks for pointing that out. We're not sure how that got into the management plan. And they changed it. It was a new manager that was on that, and they had the same manager for a decade or something before that in terms of DFO. And so
the long and the short of it, and it was not accurate what Clearwater was saying. They were not exempt. They were obligated by law to follow the 72-hour rule.
And to me, that's a big question as to how that's a DFO document, and someone in DFO had written in that document this specific line that they were exempt from that, and it had kind of gone unnoticed for a number of years. And so to me, that's, a really good example of this very close relationship they have with the regulator and had for many years. And so that was kind of the start of it.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 2019, when there was a story, an investigative expose type story by CBC, by Paul Withers, Halifax-based CBC reporter who covers fisheries. And there's a conviction of Clearwater in provincial court for a quote-unquote gross violation in the lobster fishery. Clearwater convicted of not obeying the 72-hour rule and charged assessed a fine of $30,000 as a result of this DFO enforcement. And as is clear from this CBC story, DFO was on them for some time about the 72-hour rule before these charges were laid. And one of the defenses that Clearwater used was, well, these traps were not baited, and the escape hatch was off, so therefore no big deal. But it's not necessarily that simple, because even though the traps are not baited and the trap door is off, they can still cause damage in terms of lobster getting trapped, other species getting in there. So it is a wasteful sort of anti-conservation move to have these traps on the water, baited or not.
Yeah. So it was kind of two things going on, and one thing was this idea of storing the traps, where they had for many years stored thousands of traps during the time when they didn't want to really be fishing, and they said that those were the escape hatches were open and they were not baited. So the enforcement officers had gone out finally and hauled gear and checked the gear. And even in the traps, so they fish in strings of 100 traps, and they pulled them up and they counted out the lobsters by bits and pieces, because they cannibalize each other, right? If they're all trapped in a trap, so they start to eat each other. And even in the ones that they said were unbaited, they were counting up 15,000 pounds of lobster. And that was part of the court proceedings, and then, they put it all out in records and stuff, and that's a significant amount of lobster, and that was just in a few strings that they pulled up of traps to check. And so if you think about that and multiply it by the thousands of traps that they had been doing this with, and the many years that they had been doing this with, that is a significant amount of waste of lobster. And the only reason they could do that is because when lobsters are eating each other, they leave claws and they leave bits and pieces. So they were able to count up the amount of lobsters, but they weren't able to count up, the fish that would have been eaten. So the cod and cusk is usually in there, these kinds of things. And so we really have no idea as much about how much bycatch there was of other fish. And then you have their regularly fished traps, the ones that are baited, and that they're supposed to be going out and hauling every 72 hours, and they're active. And those also, they had looked over a period of 3 years while they were doing this enforcement, and they found that 50% of their traps were regularly not hauled every 72 hours. And those are the ones that are baited. And so, you combine all of that, and finally they had some charges that stuck.
So I guess what we can infer from that is they have this quota of 720 tons, for which they catch from this exclusive area, this public resource that they have exclusive control over. So in fishing their quota, they're probably taking a lot more. The number of lobster that are taken in the process of getting their quota is even much bigger than the quota, because of the wastage of these caused by these traps.
Yeah, it must be. And it's the lobster in the area are abundant. They've never had a problem catching their 720 tons. It's quite easy for them to fill their traps all the time, and so there must be a lot of bycatch of lobster, discarded lobster wastage, because their traps are getting filled quite easily all the time. And that is not being documented. They're not having to report dead lobsters or extra lobsters. And so there's got to be a lot of wastage going on. And that area, if you look at the maps of where they're fishing, although they have this huge area that stretches all along Nova Scotia, in fact, where the lobsters are really located in the abundance of lobsters is quite close to the 50-mile line. And that 50-mile line, 50 miles offshore, is the separation between inshore and offshore. And, at the time when this offshore lobster fishery was created in the 80s and 90s, the inshore boats were fishing much more near shore, so very close to shore, much smaller boats. And these days, if you look at where the inshore fishery is in that LFA 33 and 34, which comes right up against Clearwater's area there, they're fishing right at the 50-mile line. There's a huge amount of fishing happening. They have much bigger boats, bigger traps, like they're way out there now. And Clearwater is fishing right against the 50-mile line on their side of things. And they don't have to compete with thousands of other fishermen. Everybody knows about dumping day, the first day of the season. It's very dangerous. People are, all of their traps as much as possible. They're running out there to get the right spots, and it's quite dangerous. And Clearwater doesn't have to worry about that, even though they're fishing right next to where, this is where the lobster is really abundant in the last number of years. It's nice cold waters. They like it. And so you really look at those access issues there.
Yes, and you point out LFA 34 and 33, and of course people are following the news and what's happening in Southwest Nova Scotia, and the Mi'kmaq fishers, and as you say, Clearwater's area, LFA 41, they're sort of neighbors of LFA 34, which is where most of the action has been that people have been following on the news. And there's I see there's indicated on one of the maps, there's a spawning ground that kind of straddles 41 and 34. So they are related areas, we might say.
Yeah. So there's no question that actually the population, they're all one population. It's called sub-Gulf of Maine population. And there's been genetic work that's been done, and all of from southern Maine all the way up southwest Nova and all of that, it's one population. And so, there's LFA 40, it's called, and that's a closed ground where they discovered that there was like quite a few breeding females, and they know that is seeding kind of the inshore and out and offshore. And there's still work being done, but we know that in LFA 41, there's a lot of large breeding females. And so the settlement, right? You have the lobsters and their little babies, they float around on the top of the water for a couple of years, and they're floating in and out and between all of the LFAs. And in particular in this area, this Southwest Nova area, they're seeding back and forth. And so it's all one population. And so whatever is impacting, in the different areas, it's going to be impacting the rest of the population. And so that should be a concern for folks, this idea and we know that they're catching large females, more particularly out there, and that's why 40 is next to them as well. So it really should be a concern in terms of large fecund females, and the impact of that out there in terms of they have the same minimum size as the inshore does. And how much are they discarding? How much are coming up eaten in these traps? Yes. They only have 4% of their traps are covered by observer coverage. And given the history of them, these were the one charges that finally got to court, but you can ask anyone in the area. People know that they've been doing this for decades,
And what is the situation now? We had this court case in 2019. Is Clearwater abiding by the 72-hour rule at this moment? Have they cleaned up their act?
That's a very good question. And I was hoping to ask that question just about now, because what happened was, they went to the court, they got this fine. They made some promises, and they managed to retain their sustainability certification despite having been convicted in court of illegal fishing. And to maintain that certification, they made promises about, yes, they're going to fish within the rules, and they're going to show people that they've been doing that somehow, hopefully by showing us their fishing tracks and timing, and that they were going to reduce the amount of traps that they had out there and these things. We argued that they should have had to show that within a year to get their certification back, but the certification body decided, okay, after a year, show us the evidence. And they're also supposed to be showing this big research projects that they've been doing on soak times with both public and private money that no one has ever been able to see. And so that was supposed to be about now. But the audit, I've just discovered from the certification company, has been pushed back 6 months because of COVID delays. And upcoming is the annual management meeting for this fishery. We've been keeping an eye on it, and I don't, we have lots of fishermen down there in Shelburne that have been watching the dock. They have their own private wharf to see if they are indeed coming in and out. So one of the biggest things that tweaked the enforcement officers to it is this, like they dry dock they're up in the dock for 2 weeks at a time, or they lend their boat out for other people to use, and they're just not around. So we have had some fishermen that have been watching that over the year to see, like, are they in the dock for more than 72 hours here and there? Are we seeing large amounts of traps coming in? And we are kind of gathering that, and there is some evidence over this past year that there have been times when they've been sitting in that dock for a long time. And we saw new traps going out by the hundreds, but we haven't seen like massive amounts of 1,000 traps coming in. So it's unclear whether they've really changed their practices. I've had some chats with Clearwater, and they said they've reduced their traps down to 6,500. And so, I intend to ask the DFO what they've done in the last year to prove, that they've changed this. Have they increased their observer coverage? Have they been watching their vessel tracks? Like, where is the evidence that they've changed their fishing? Because as far as we can see on, publicly available stuff, they haven't shifted too much.
Right, Shannon. Well, I think this story will be continued. This is not the end of the story. We're just in the middle of the story. So, thank you for your work on this, and thanks for chatting about it.
No problem.
Shannon Arnold, Marine Program Senior Coordinator at the Ecology Action Center in Halifax. We contacted Clearwater and asked if they are currently obeying the 72-hour rule. We received no response. And that's it for the program. If you listen to us via podcast, could you please like us on whatever platform you use? Help us get higher and higher in those podcast listings. Allison Baker is the producer of Mi'kmaq Matters. I'm Glenn Wheeler. Novartis. Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. I'm Glenn Wheeler. It's late in the evening, after the Bay St. George powwow, and I'm with the ancestors in Breaks Cove, in what's now known as Corner Brook. We all have those places we go to connect to something bigger, and this is one of mine. Do you? Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. I'm Glenn Wheeler. Support independent Mi'kmaq media. Become a Mi'kmaq Matters patron at patreon.com/Mi'kmaq Matters. We thank you for your financial support. This past Thursday, Mi'kmaq Matters was in Port-au-Port East for a meeting of the Port-au-Port Bay Fishery Committee. The special guest at the meeting was Bill Bryden of the Newfoundland and Labrador Coalition for Aquaculture Reform. Bill Bryden gave a graphic slide presentation outlining the environmental impact of marine net pen salmon farms of the sort that have been set up in Newfoundland. Impacts. Welcome to Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. I'm Glenn Wheeler. Support independent Mi'kmaq media. Become a Mi'kmaq Matters patron at patreon.com KPT.com/Mi'kmaq Matters. We thank you for your financial support. One of the ways that our Mi'kmaq ancestors have kept in touch with us is through petroglyphs. After being let down by the RCMP and DFO, first we celebrated, and now we reflect. First, we celebrated. After being let down by the RCMP and DFO, Sabaganagani First Nation plans multiple lawsuits against those who have harassed and assaulted moderate livelihood fishers. We speak to the lawyer leading the legal charge. I'm Glenn Wheeler, and this is First, we celebrated, and now we reflect on the Clearwater sale to Mi'kmaq First Nations. What does it mean for corporate control, the inshore fishery, and the owner-operator rule? I'm Glenn Wheeler, and this is Mi'kmaq Matters, a podcast about Mi'kmaq people, politics, land, and water. This is episode 159, and a special thank you to listeners like Allison Smith, who support us on patreon.com/Mi'kmaq Matters or via email transfer to mi'kmaq.matters@gmail.com. Below. This week, more on the major corporate move by 6 Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia and Neobigag in Newfoundland. All 13 Mi'kmaq communities got an invite. Only one Mi'kmaq band in the two provinces was left out in the cold. And that was, of course, Qalipu, left out just as it was last year, when all 14 Mi'kmaq communities in the two provinces, all but Qalipu, entered into a revenue sharing agreement with Clearwater regarding the surf clam fishery. Why is that? We'll see if that question comes up at the meeting of Qalipu Chief and Council this coming Saturday, November 28th, starting at 10 a.m. Newfoundland time. Qalipu members can watch the live stream of the meeting. Make sure your info is up to date on GINU, because you'll need that to sign on. One thing that for sure will confront Chief and Council is enrollment. Supporters of Mi'kmaq people who have been denied or lost their status in Qalipu will gather on the majestic lawn outside the Qalipu building, starting at 9 a.m. Members of the group call themselves the Lost Ones. They include Greg James, former chief of the Burgeo Band of Indians, who lost his status card because he spent time away from Burgeo serving in the Canadian Forces. We had expected vets and RCMP officers to have their status cards back by now, but there's still no sign of that. The group is inviting Chief Brendan Mitchell and members of council to meet with them before the meeting to provide an update on enrollment. Joy followed news that 7 Mi'kmaq communities would spend $250 million to purchase Clearwater's offshore lobster licenses. It was the perfect antidote to those awful images of moderate livelihood fishers being harassed by non-native fishers in southwest Nova Scotia. Now, we Mi'kmaq people would be the boss. But what does it mean to have Mi'kmaq involved in an industrial operation such as Clearwater, a convicted violator of fishing regulations? And what does it mean to have Mi'kmaq with one foot in the inshore fishery and another in the offshore? Is that the first step in the erosion of the owner-operator policy, which requires harvesters to fish their licenses personally? Many questions, few answers. For analysis of the Mi'kmaq Clearwater buy, I turned to Tony Charles, a professor in the School of the Environment and the School of Business at St. Mary's University in Halifax. Tony, so let me tell listeners a little bit about you, and they'll understand why I'm so pleased to have you on the program, talking about the Clearwater sale. You're a senior research fellow in environment and sustainability at St. Mary's, and you teach in the School of the Environment and the School of Business. So I think that's covering a lot of the bases that come up in this Clearwater story, sustainability and business. Plus, I see that soon after the Marshall decision came out, you received a Pew Fellowship for a project called Turning the Tide, Communities Managing Fisheries Together, which is also relevant to this discussion, I think. So it's great to have you on the program. So maybe I can ask you first, I could ask you the where were you question. Where were you when you got the news about the Clearwater sale, and how did you hear about it, and what did you think?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure if it's such a profound event that one remembers where they were at the time. But I was here in Halifax, perhaps working on some other fishery topic, and I've been monitoring for the past several weeks, and doing some writing as well about the relatively new Mi'kmaq moderate livelihood fisheries, and so in a sense very focused on those new fisheries and how they're developing, and some of the issues and concerns from the conventional lobster fishery sector about that. So it came out of the blue when we're suddenly shifting attention from the what are really community-based, local level fisheries, the moderate livelihood fisheries the Mi'kmaq First Nations are developing, turning to this billion-dollar deal for a very large seafood company and fish harvesting company. In fact, the connection, I happen to have been writing an article 2 weeks ago, perhaps something like that, that was discussing the emergence of more Mi'kmaq presence in the fishery generally, and one little paragraph of that article referred to saying, well, in terms of possibilities, maybe we might look at the offshore, the more industrial fishery sector as a place where there could be increasing Mi'kmaq involvement, and just I must say I was very surprised where I thought that was just an idea that I was floating out there, and then within 2 weeks after that, the deal was announced. Not that my article had any bearing at all on that, but it was just for me something where I thought it was just some ideas, but now they're reality.
But I wonder what it does for a discussion about communities, because you were in your work, you talk about how community control of fisheries is a good thing, both in terms of sustainability and in terms of economic fairness. It helps to circulate more money in communities. But now we have different communities. We have Mi'kmaq communities that are part of the Clearwater deal and those that are not. We have Mi'kmaq communities that have moderate livelihood fisheries and are in the Clearwater deal, so they have a foot in both camps. And we have the inshore commercial fishers in southwest Nova Scotia. So it must make the situation a bit more complicated from your point of view.
It is, and let me say that I do have a particular belief from everything I see that fisheries that are based in local communities on the coast, where the local community depends on that fishery, and they've in a sense developed with the fishery, so that the people on the coast and the fish in the ocean are connected together closely. That kind of situation to me is important, both for the social fabric of a place and for the sustainability of the resource, because people who live in a place tend to be better at taking care of the resources there, in this case the fish, let's say the lobster in particular. So I think community-based fisheries are important, even though my preference is for more local community-based fisheries. As long as there's going to be those offshore fisheries, then in my opinion, not having seen anything, this is just a new deal now, but I would like to think that on a scale of Atlantic Canada, where you have the Mi'kmaq Nation having been here for 13,000 years or so, that if you're going to have some people taking care of a resource on a larger scale across Atlantic Canada, because the offshore fishery is a more, it's not as localized as community-based fisheries. It's more large scale and covers the Atlantic more, then I'm happy to see the Mi'kmaq nations involved in that.
Let me ask you a bit about the Mi'kmaq involvement, because the impression we get is that Clearwater will remain an entity as it is now. The ownership, the management team will stay in place, and Mi'kmaq will be part owners along with Premium Brands. But if we were looking at it from the outside, we would not see much difference in the way Clearwater operates. And we know from previous media reports that Clearwater has been guilty of violations, fisheries violations of the 72-hour rule. So, do you think that the merely Mi'kmaq ownership will make any difference to Clearwater and the way it operates?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's too early to see that. I think when you refer to violations of the regulations and behavior that's not in the spirit of conservation, well, the new owners of Clearwater are going to have to deal with that history, and we're going to have to wait and see, I guess, what the new owners have to say about the practices of Clearwater. And I know that I will be watching that because, I, like so many of us, I do care deeply about conservation and the sustainability of the resource. So I think that's going to be an important thing for us to watch. Mi'kmaq First Nations, some Mi'kmaq First Nations are part of the coalition, but then perhaps 50% of the control of Clearwater will be in the hands of a holding company, Premium Brands, that doesn't live here in Atlantic Canada, that's from the west coast of Canada, that has been buying up many different seafood companies, I gather recently. We'll have to wait and see how that balance happens in terms of the ownership of Clearwater and the conservation behavior of Clearwater. It's something really to monitor because that is an important aspect. The spirit of the new moderate livelihood fisheries, the underlying nature of them. In fact, I've seen Mi'kmaq chiefs referring to these moderate livelihood fisheries as, and pardon my pronunciation here, Methugama fisheries, which brings in the Mi'kmaq spirit of attention to conservation and taking care of nature. So the moderate livelihood fisheries have that strong potential, and they all come with management plans, those inshore fisheries. I guess what I'll be interested to see is, does that approach carry over to this offshore and to Clearwater?
The other issue you've raised is the relationship between Clearwater going forward and the inshore fishers, because Clearwater is also a buyer of the inshore catch. And I guess if you're an inshore fisher, you always want more for your catch, and and Clearwater would be is the buyer. But I wonder if it's realistic to think that anything about the relationship will change, because of course the Mi'kmaq coalition has they paid a lot of money for Clearwater, and they'll need to make a return on their investment. So is it realistic to think that anything will change about that Clearwater inshore buyer relationship.
Well, that's another good question, right? What we've just been talking about, in a sense, was what does Clearwater do in the offshore area in terms of their fishing activity, and this point is how do they behave in terms of their buying of lobster inshore, close to shore, from a whole range of coastal communities all across the region, and that is also a really important question. Maybe they just stay the same. Anything I could say at this point would just be speculation, because we really don't know what will be the objectives of their buying of lobster. I like to think that perhaps with and this again is just thinking out loud about it, that a coalition of First Nations, each First Nation being rooted in communities, that maybe that will bring to the buying of lobster an increased understanding of the importance of maintaining the health of coastal communities all across the region. In other words, a kind of a community understanding that perhaps wasn't there as much before. I'm not sure. Maybe that comes, and maybe that just helps to ensure that that the buying of lobster takes into account the importance of coastal communities.
So if we could look, I mean, if you could visualize a happy ending to this story, that the Mi'kmaq purchase of Clearwater leads to something good and better than what it is today, what would that future look like if you could have it your way?
Well, I guess to me there's three big important objectives that I have in my mind. One is the importance of increasing the role of Mi'kmaq First Nations in the economic life of the region, and so that's something that comes in many different ways. It's not just by buying a large company like Clearwater, but that is a component, I think. So that's one element. So Indigenous fishing rights and Indigenous involvement in the economy. A second is the importance of the rural fabric of the region, and in particular the coastal communities of the region. How do we ensure that communities all along the coast are and can increasingly be in a healthy state? And the third is the environment, and we talked about that earlier, the conservation aspect, and how important it is to be careful about the ocean environment and the ocean life within it. So those three aspects, I guess, if we can keep all those in mind, both in terms of the corporate side and the coastal communities and inshore fishery side, I think that would be the win-win-win kind of situation. And whether we see that happen, we'll have to keep monitoring. But certainly, I think there is a lot of knowledge that's built up about how to manage fisheries and how to maintain conservation in the ocean that is found in First Nations, but also in a whole range of coastal communities across the region. And so, we need to be tapping in to the knowledge base of everyone in the region to achieve those big aims, I think.
Right, Tony. Well, as you say, there's a lot we don't know at this point, and I wonder, maybe the last thing I could ask you is, myself, I've been struck by the, somewhat, not to be harsh on media, but a somewhat superficial quality about the coverage thus far. It's covered the announcement and the positive aspects of it, which and of course we recognize those. But I wonder what are the questions that reporters should be exploring as we go forward and want to know more about the purchase. Well, I guess one thing would be, and this might be something as a teacher of business that you're curious about, is the structure of the deal and what the various actors will be doing as part of this new arrangement going forward. What else are you wanting to know to completely understand what's happening here?
Well, I think one of the big fundamental issues that we're facing that is actually it's a bit hidden away in the discussion of all this, and that is the nature of who is the fishery in a sense. And I don't mean just the Clearwater aspect, because as I said at the start, there is this Clearwater exists. It's built up over the years. It's had a monopoly of lobster licenses in the offshore area for quite a long time, until very recently, and now basically it's handing over those licenses to this coalition of First Nations. But this is a very corporate part of the whole fishery. To me, the lifeblood of the fishery and the coastal communities is the inshore, and in particular, the independent operators in the fishery, what we call the owner operators, the ones who, and this is true whether it's non-Indigenous or Indigenous, the people who have boats and operate their boats and going out fishing, the community-minded people in a sense. And to me, the key issue is to ensure that whatever happens in the corporate side and in the inshore side doesn't jeopardize that the independent fishers all across the region of all forms, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, whatever species they're fishing for. That's the lifeblood that really keeps the coastal communities going and coastal First Nations going. So that's something to be looking out for. Even though we're talking here about a big corporate deal, ultimately the health of the region, I think, depends more on what goes on in coastal communities.
So you're concerned about any erosion of that owner-operator rule in the fishery, that we've made a policy decision that the fishery operates that way. So with Mi'kmaq buying Clearwater, and there's a bit of an overlap between Moderate Livelihood and the Clearwater deal, it somewhat muddies the waters a little bit potentially.
Well, yes, I guess that when I think about what people know, I think there's a wide range of Indigenous knowledge that non-Indigenous folks all around this region need to understand. The whole idea of Indigenous knowledge. There's also, I think, that as Mi'kmaq First Nations get more into lobster fishing and other kinds of fishing, there's also the struggles that mostly non-Indigenous fishers have gone through, especially over the last 25 years, to maintain the independence and the small boat nature of the coastal fishery in the region. And so I think one thing that's important for Mi'kmaq First Nations to know is that struggle that's gone on to maintain that small boat fishery. And it's been tough on a lot of coastal communities that have had to have to work hard and engage in protests and so on to keep that fishery as that owner-operator idea. That is important. The other thing that I think they are very clear on in the lobster fishery is the importance of avoiding setting quotas, catch quotas in the fishery, which was one of the big factors in the cod collapse that was almost 30 years ago now, was the failure of setting quotas. In fact, the lobster fishery on the coast around Atlantic Canada has operated very nicely with trap limits instead. So how many lobster traps you can set, not by deciding on how much catch you can have. So there's some understanding in the fishery of what has worked over decades and decades And that's an important knowledge base, I think, to build on. That's a bit different in the offshore where Clearwater catches lobster. They have a different management scheme there. But for the inshore, it's important for everyone to know what has worked and why it's worked over the years.
Tony Charles, a professor in the School of the Environment and the School of Business at St. Mary's University in Halifax. And that's it for the program. Allison Baker is the producer of Mi'kmaq Matters. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter for the latest Mi'kmaq news and views. I'm Glenn Wheeler, Nemontis.
Well,